Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk about tracking mistakes that caused sample ratio mismatch warnings, most of them from my time at booking.com. So a quick intro first. My name is Jonas. I'm a father of 4 girls. I've been doing experimentation for over 13 years now. I started most of it when I joined booking.com in 2008. I built an experimentation platform for Booking. In 2012, I was responsible for experimentation there. Everything from the culture, new metrics being added to the platform, the training, etc. In 2015, when I left Booking, Booking was running more than 1,000 experiments simultaneously all the time and starting more than 100 every day. And I started consulting on experimentation, helping other companies. In 2019, I became one of the founders of AB Smartly. Let's start with some data. This is from the index page at booking.com many years ago, but I believe that the user behavior has not changed. What we see here is that around 27% of the users scrolled at least like more than 30 pixels on the page. Around 80% scrolled a full page, 2000 pixels or more. And less than 4% scrolled the whole page to the footer. Basically, this means that if you are going to run one experiment down below the fold, down on the footer, then only 4% of your traffic will actually be exposed to the change. But at Booking at the time, we were running only experiments server side, so we didn't have a way to track experiments on the client side. And this was a problem because for this kind of experiments, we would track mostly noise. In this case, 96% of the traffic that was being tracked in this page or triggered in this page was just adding noise to the data. So this is like one very important rule of A/B testing is to trigger only users that see a change. And at Booking at that time, then we actually build a way to do this. So basically the rule is that before trigger the user, you always add a condition, and that condition is the one that should be met for the user to see the change. Another very important rule is that to be able to do experimentation at scale, you need to make it super easy for developers and designers to run tests, right? Otherwise, they will prefer to just make the change without testing. If they spend more time making it possible to be A/B tested than the time that they spend building the feature, then why bother? All of them will give up, right? So you need to make it super easy for developers to run experiments. So at Booking, we actually created some helper attributes that developers could use. So first we actually create this track function in the client side as well. Before we had it only in the server side. And then we actually made like a few helpers like this that would create some attributes that developers and designers could just put on the templates to track experiments without having to write a lot of code. To be able to run experiments like the example that we gave on the footer, we also created this attribute extract on view. And then the user would be triggered only when the footer is visible on the viewport. So this is how you would add it. Like you would add to any element on the page, extract on view equals experiment name, and this experiment would be triggered at that point. On AB Smartly, we did something very similar. This is an example of our view SDK. Here you can see that we support a trigger on view attribute as well. And this makes it possible to trigger the experiment only when this element is visible on the page, instead of being triggered when the template is rendered. We also created a last mix-in. This is very helpful, especially for responsive web applications. Let's say that you want to track something on the page, but only for mobile users. Then you can add the class name to the right media query, and it will be triggered only for those devices instead of for everything. Now let's talk a little bit about some tracking mistakes that we made. Most of them were from my time at Booking.com, but others also from other companies. In these examples, someone wanted to run one experiment to avoid a round trip to the server just to show this message. Basically, before, if you would click search without having a destination, we were making a request to the server side just to see that there was not a destination field, going back to the client side just to show an error message to enter a destination for the search. And someone just wanted to make that with JavaScript. So if there was not a destination set, we would not make the round trip, we would just show the message right away. So basically, the developer did something like this. I'm using here jQuery just to make it easier to understand. Of course, that you would be using a more modern framework now. Basically, if the query, if the value of the search was empty, and the user was in the variant, then we would show the message. We would not submit the form, and that's it, right? And otherwise, if the user was not in the treatment, then the form would be submitted normally, and the previous behavior would be shown. But this created a sample ratio mismatch. When doing experimentation client side, we need to send data to the server side to track the users that are exposed to the experiments and the goals that are achieved by those users, etc. So this treatment call was actually sending a request to the backend to tell us that the user was being exposed to this experiment. And because this is inside of a submit handler, then this request was being dropped, like cut by the browser, only on the variant that was submitting the form. So basically on the control group, we were not sending the treatment calls to the server side, but on the variant, because we would actually prevent the form to be submitted, then those calls were being sent to the server side. In the end, the experiment report would show something like this: 0 visitors triggered in the control group, and all the visitors triggered in the variant, right? 100% of the users in the variant, 0% of the users in the control group, so you get a sample ratio mismatch. And this is like an extreme one. There are other SRMs that are a lot more difficult to see. To make it work properly, you could have done something like this, like in the variant, you show the message. Otherwise, you wait for so instead of just submitting the form, you wait for the experiment data to be published to the backend, and only after that is done, you trigger the submit for the form. Of course, that in this case, you are actually changing the control group, which is something that you should never do. But in this case, it's either do it or not being able to run the experiment at all. Let's now look at another experiment that was being done below the fold. So in this case, we want to use the trigger on view stuff that we talked before. So in this case, we have these two blocks and we want to swap the blocks. So in the variant, instead of having block 1 and then block 2, we want to have block 2 and then block 1. So we could do it with the extract on view like this on the block 1. But this would cause a problem, right? So if you track these on block 1 only, then on the control group, the users would be triggered at this height on the page, and in the variant, the users would be triggered lower on the page, which means that just by having like a larger viewport, you might be triggering users in the control group and not in the variant. And then you have a lot more users in the control group than in the variant. Or if the users just scroll a little bit, they are triggered in one of the variants but not in the other variant. So this would also create a sample ratio mismatch. Something that we could do is to add the track on view to both blocks. But what we noticed that was even better was to just add like an empty div. Again, you are changing the control group by adding something that was not there before, but this is like quite a simple change that should not have any impact on anything except on the tracking of the experiment. At AB Smartly, we did actually something a lot safer. Like we added the trigger on view attribute as well, but because this is always inside of the treatment component, this is actually the SDK for Vue.js, where we actually created the treatment component, and then if that component is on view, then we swap basically we swap the elements, right? And this actually avoids all those mistakes that you do when you are doing it manually, because it's automated with the SDK does it for you. In one of the variants it's in this order, in the other variant it's in the other order, and just by adding this attribute it will trigger it when it is in the viewport. Another example: someone realized that some users were confused with the stars that were shown after the hotel name. Some users thought that this was the review score, and others assumed correctly that it was the star rating of the hotel. This was done a long time ago, but it's still there. Now if you hover the stars, you get a tooltip that explains what this actually means, so that it is an official hotel rating and not a review score. When this was implemented, so when the experiment was run, the developer triggered the experiment when the user would pass the mouse over the stars. But this made it in a way, so they made it in a way that would, just by doing this, would trigger the experiment. So many users were just moving the mouse cursor and were being triggered into the experiment, even though they were not being exposed to the tooltip. They were not seeing the change, but they were being triggered in the experiment. So there was a lot of noise in the data. Many users that were not seeing the change were being tracked. So we restarted the experiment with a delay. So this time, just by doing this would not trigger the experiment. You had to wait at least 300 milliseconds over the stars before the user was triggered, before we would send the event to trigger the user. And this was better, but we still saw a sample ratio mismatch. And after some investigation, someone figured out that in the control group, the mouse cursor was not a question mark. So the user that implemented the experiment not only added the tooltip, but also made the cursor a question mark when hovering the stars. The thing is that the cursor turns into the question mark right away, even before the 300 milliseconds pass. So some users that were just moving the mouse were noticing that the cursor was changing, and they would go back and over it to see what was a message that would be shown, right? So just because the user made a change that was being triggered before the experiment was being triggered, that was being shown before the experiment was being triggered, that changed the user behavior. So basically, anytime that you do some change in the web page that affects the user behavior before, and you do it only in one of the variations and not in the other variation, then that will trigger a sample ratio mismatch. I can tell you almost all the time that will happen. So be very careful with making changes before triggering the user. You need to be sure that every time that you make a change on the page, that you are also triggering the user at that point. If you are going to trigger it only later, then you are going to have issues. Another example with a change that happens below the fold. In this case, we have blocks that are larger than what we had previously. So let's say that because it's below the fold, we use the same trick as before. We use either the tracking line or the track on view. But what happened was that we were still able to see sample ratio mismatch warning in the dashboards. This was very, very strange. We had all the tracking correct. We had like the tracking line before the blocks. So both variants would be triggered exactly at the same height on the page, but we're still getting a sample ratio mismatch. What happened? Basically, after a lot of investigation, and I don't recall like who came up with the idea, I think that someone looked at the segments for the experiment and they noticed that it was mostly on Internet Explorer that the sample ratio mismatch warning was occurring. So if we would exclude Internet Explorer, it was mostly 50-50, but on Internet Explorer we would see the biggest difference between the variants. And then someone came up with the idea, well, maybe this is because of the scroll bars. Like people see that on Internet Explorer the scroll bars are visible all the time. Maybe people see that there is more content in one of the variants. Like in one of the variants there was a larger page, so the scroll bar would show that there was like actually more content below. So it was more likely for the people in that variation to scroll down, to scroll to the place where the triggering would happen than in the other variation, which is how can you run one experiment and be sure that you are doing things correctly when everything is fine and it's the browser that is giving hints to the user about something that that is not correct, right? So it's super difficult. So what you could do in this case is to load the content, so having both pages the same before triggering, and only when the user reaches that part of the page, so when the user scrolls down to bring that content to the viewport, you actually load the content with Ajax or something like that. This was it. I hope you had fun, and the next time that you see a sample ratio mismatch on your experiment, that you know what to do. Take care.